The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the cemetery cold and damp. The sky, still wrapped in the soft hues of early morning, stretched endlessly above the silent tombstones. A well-dressed man stood before one of them, his aged hands trembling as he placed a bouquet of white lilies against the cold marble. His eyes darkened with grief, the kind that never fades, no matter how many years pass. This was his son's grave. A deep sigh left his chest as he whispered, "I'm sorry." The words felt hollow, almost meaningless. How many times had he stood here, saying the same thing? And yet, nothing changed. His son was still gone. The weight of unspoken words, unresolved regrets hung around him like a noose. Then, suddenly, he wasn't alone. A few feet away, standing just within the shadows, was a young man. He was thin, dressed in simple, worn-out clothes, but there was something strikingly familiar about him. He wasn't a random visitor, not just another mourner passing by. No, he was here for this grave. The millionaire's heart tightened. Who was he? Why was he here? And why was he staring at his son's name as if it meant something more? The young man knelt down slowly, brushing his fingers over the engraved letters. His lips moved in a whisper too soft to hear. The older man hesitated before stepping forward. His voice came out rough, colder than he intended. "Who are you?" The young man didn't flinch. He didn't even seem surprised. Instead, he looked up with calm, knowing eyes and said something that sent a sharp chill through the millionaire's spine. "I've been waiting for you." Silence. A long, uneasy silence stretched between them. The older man's pulse pounded. Waiting? What did that mean? He studied the stranger carefully. The young man looked no older than his mid-20s, but there was something unsettling about him, as if he carried a weight much heavier than his years. The businessman's instinct screamed danger, but something deeper, more primal, kept him frozen in place. How did this stranger know him? Before he could speak again, the young man did something even more unsettling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded note, old and crumpled, as if it had been carried for years. He held it out. "This is for you." The millionaire hesitated before taking it. The paper felt fragile, almost sacred, in his hands. Unfolding it slowly, his heart stopped when he saw the handwriting. It was his son's. The world seemed to tilt for a moment. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't possible. His son had died years ago. And yet, here was a note, written by his son, held by a stranger who shouldn't exist. The older man looked up sharply, his mind racing. Who was this young man? And how did he have something that should have been buried with his son? The young man simply stared back at him, his expression unreadable. Then, just as calmly as he had arrived, he turned and began to walk away. "Wait," the millionaire's voice came out hoarse, but the young man didn't stop. Without another word, he disappeared into the mist, leaving the businessman alone, holding a letter that should never have existed. The old businessman stood frozen, his fingers tightening around the letter. His heart pounded, his breath uneven. This couldn't be real. The note felt old, the edges worn and creased, but the handwriting. It was unmistakable. His son's. His hands shook as he carefully unfolded the fragile paper. The ink was slightly faded, but the words hit him like a lightning bolt. "If you're reading this, then I was right. You were always meant to find him." The businessman's chest tightened painfully. His son's words, written years ago, meant for him to see now. His eyes darted back to the path where the young man had disappeared. Who was he? He turned, scanning the cemetery. Empty. The young man was gone. Panic surged through his veins. He needed answers. Stuffing the note into his coat pocket, he rushed to his car. The expensive black sedan stood parked near the iron gates. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped down the road, eyes darting across the sidewalks, searching. Nothing. The young man had vanished into thin air. A lead into the unknown. The old businessman sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. He needed to think. He pulled out his phone, hesitating before dialing a number. "Find someone for me," he said when his private investigator picked up. A young man, early 20s. Dark hair. Worn clothes. "He was at my son's grave today." There was a brief silence. "Understood. Do you have a name?" The businessman exhaled sharply. "No." Another pause. "That might take some time." "Then start now." He ended the call. His fingers reached for the letter again. He reread the words, his pulse quickening. Meant to find him. It wasn't a coincidence. His son had written this, for him. But why? The past had already taken too much from him. His son, his peace, his ability to sleep without regrets. And now, it seemed, it had one more secret left to reveal. He had no choice. He had to find the young man. The search begins the next morning. The businessman sat in his study, staring at his investigator's report. It was thin. The young man had no official records. No ID. No bank accounts. No digital footprint. As if he didn't exist. But there was one clue. A local florist near the cemetery had seen him before. "He comes every week," the florist had said. "Always buys a single white lily." A white lily. The same flowers the businessman left at his son's grave. His breath caught. How did the young man know? And more importantly, why was he mourning his son? The businessman grabbed his coat, determination burning in his chest. If the young man came every week, that meant he would return. All he had to do was wait. A face from the past 3 days later, the businessman was back at the cemetery. Waiting. Watching. Then, he saw him. The young man walked toward the grave, shoulders slightly hunched, a single white lily in his hand. The businessman's stomach clenched. This time, he wouldn't let him escape. He stepped forward. "You. Stop." The young man didn't flinch. He didn't look startled or afraid. Instead, he smiled. Like he had been expecting this. The businessman's pulse thundered in his ears. "Who are you?" The young man sighed, kneeling by the grave and gently placing the lily against the marble stone. He ran his fingers over the name, his expression unreadable. Then, he finally spoke. "I think you already know." The older man's breath hitched. The words, the voice. Something clicked in his brain. It wasn't possible. And yet, as the wind swept through the cemetery, the undeniable truth settled in his bones like a cold chill. He did know. But he wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet. The cold wind swept through the cemetery, but the businessman barely felt it. His entire body was rigid, his heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. "I think you already know." The young man's words hung in the air, heavy, almost suffocating. The businessman's fingers curled into fists. No. He didn't know. He refused to know. He took a slow, measured step closer. "Stop playing games. I need the truth." The young man sighed, looking down at the gravestone again, his fingers grazing the engraved letters. His son's name. Then, softly, he said, "Your son didn't die the way you think he did." The older man felt the ground shift beneath him. His breath came sharp, his mind screaming at him to shut this conversation down. But he couldn't walk away. Not now. He forced his voice to stay even. "What are you talking about?" The young man exhaled slowly, almost as if he were choosing his words carefully. Then, without another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A key. Rusty, old, but unmistakable. The businessman stared at it. It was familiar, painfully so. His chest tightened. This key had once belonged to his son. It was for a storage unit, one his son had rented just before his death. But after the funeral, when the businessman had gone looking, the unit had been emptied. Everything inside was gone. Now, years later, this stranger was holding the same key. The older man's throat went dry. "Where did you get that?" The young man finally looked at him, his gaze deep, unreadable. "From the person who took everything." A memory resurfaces. The businessman snatched the key from the young man's hand, his fingers tightening around it. The cold metal pressed against his skin, but his mind was somewhere else. A memory, buried deep, forced its way to the surface. His son, standing in his office, his hands shaking as he held this very key. He had begged his father to listen. "Dad, I need to tell you something. It's important." But the businessman had been too busy. Too caught up in his work, his deals, his wealth. "Not now," he had said. "We'll talk later." Later never came. And now, years later, a stranger stood before him, holding that same key, hinting at a secret his son had left behind. Rage and regret clashed inside him. What had he missed? What was his son trying to tell him that day? And, who had taken everything from the storage unit? The businessman's voice was sharp, laced with barely restrained anger. "Where is the unit now?" The young man watched him for a moment before finally answering. "I can take you there." A journey into the unknown. The drive was silent. The businessman's grip was tight on the steering wheel, his thoughts spinning too fast to control. The young man sat in the passenger seat, calm, almost eerily so. The older man shot him a glance. Who was he? Every part of him wanted to believe this was some kind of trick. Some scam. But then there was the letter. The key. The way he spoke about his son. It was too personal. The car slowed as they reached the outskirts of the city. A rundown storage facility stood ahead, its gates rusted, its sign faded. The businessman's stomach tightened. Why here? He parked, stepped out, and followed the young man toward one of the units. Number 47. His hands shook as he lifted the key. It fit perfectly. With a deep breath, he turned it. The lock clicked open. And as he lifted the door, the past came rushing back in. The secret inside the unit was dusty, untouched for years. But the moment the businessman stepped inside, his breath caught. Stacked neatly against the back wall were boxes. His son's boxes. The same ones that had vanished after his death. The older man's chest tightened painfully. Someone had taken them. Hidden them. But why? And why bring them back now? His fingers trembled as he reached for the nearest box, lifting the lid. Inside were old journals, letters, photographs, pieces of a life he thought he had lost forever. Then his eyes fell on something else. Something that made his blood turn to ice. A folder. Inside it, documents. His son's last investigation. And one name stood out, circled in red ink. A name the businessman knew very well. His own business partner. The same man who had helped him build his empire. His stomach dropped. The young man's voice was quiet, but filled with meaning. Now you understand. The businessman clenched his fists. No. He didn't just understand. He finally knew. His son hadn't just died. He had been silenced. And now, after all these years, the truth was back. And this time, he wasn't going to ignore it. The businessman's hands trembled as he gripped the folder. His eyes scanned the documents, each line sending a new shockwave of realization through his body. His son had been investigating something dangerous. And now he was gone. His breath felt shallow, his chest tightening as he stared at the circled name on the page. His own business partner. The man he had trusted for years. The man who had stood beside him at his son's funeral, offering words of comfort. A wave of rage and nausea crashed over him. Had he been standing next to his son's murderer all this time? The young man remained silent, watching him carefully. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Your son wasn't the only one who knew the truth." The businessman snapped his head up, his throat tight. "What do you mean?" The young man walked toward another box, lifting the lid. Inside, more papers, letters, and photographs. But one stood out. It was a picture of his son, standing with someone else. Someone familiar. The older man felt his pulse thunder in his ears. He knew that face. It was the young man standing right in front of him. The world seemed to tilt. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just some stranger. The young man stepped closer, his gaze unreadable. "I knew your son," he said finally. "And he saved my life." A connection from the past. The older man staggered back, gripping the edge of a nearby shelf to steady himself. His mind raced. Impossible. His son had never mentioned anyone like him. Yet here he was, with the letter, the key, and now proof they had known each other. The young man reached for another paper and handed it to him. It was a signed witness statement. His son's name was on it. So was the young man's. And at the bottom, one sentence stood out in bold: "If anything happens to me, this is why." The businessman's blood ran cold. He gripped the paper so tightly his knuckles turned white. His son had left behind a warning. A warning he had never seen. He turned back to the young man, his voice hoarse. "What were you and my son trying to expose?" The young man hesitated for a moment before answering. "Corruption. Fraud. The kind that gets people killed." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The businessman had always known his industry was ruthless. Deals were made, contracts were broken, fortunes were built and destroyed overnight. But he had never imagined his own empire had been built on something worse. Something criminal. His mind replayed every conversation he had with his son before he died. The moments when his son had tried to tell him something. The warnings he had ignored. Regret clawed at his chest. He should have listened. Now, years later, the truth was staring him in the face. And he couldn't ignore it anymore. The pieces come together. The businessman exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. He flipped through the papers, scanning the details. It all made sense now. His son had discovered fraud within the company. A money laundering scheme. Millions funneled into illegal accounts, covered up by his own business partner. His son had tried to expose it, but someone had stopped him. Permanently. The older man clenched his fists. He had spent years grieving, thinking his son's death was an accident. But now, he knew the truth. It wasn't an accident. It was murder. He turned back to the young man, his voice low and dangerous. "Why are you showing me this now?" The young man met his gaze. "Because you still have a choice." The businessman felt a storm raging inside him. A choice. To bury the truth, or expose it. To protect the empire he built, or burn it down to get justice. His hands trembled. For the first time in years, he knew exactly what his son would want him to do. He lifted his gaze, his voice like steel. "Tell me everything." The businessman stood frozen, his heart pounding like a war drum. The air inside the storage unit felt thick, suffocating, but he couldn't move. His fingers tightened around the papers, his son's handwriting burning into his memory. A warning. A plea for justice. A truth buried for years. And now, a choice. The young man watched him, his expression unreadable. Waiting. Finally, the businessman spoke, his voice cold, steady. Tell me everything. The young man exhaled, nodding. Your son wasn't just investigating corruption, he said. He uncovered something bigger. Something that got him killed. The older man's stomach twisted. What do you mean? The young man pulled another file from the box and handed it over. Your company. It's connected to more than just fraud. The businessman flipped it open, his eyes scanning the reports. Then he saw it. Names. Dates. Transactions. Millions of dollars funneled into offshore accounts. And worse, government contracts. Illegal deals. Backroom agreements. This wasn't just corporate fraud. This was a criminal empire. And his business partner was right in the middle of it. His breath caught. So was his own name. A hard truth to swallow. The businessman's hands shook as he set the papers down. His name. How deep was he in? The realization hit him like a freight train. He had been blind. For years, he had trusted his business partner, let him handle the financial side of things. Signed the papers. Ignored the details. And now, those same documents were evidence of something he never intended to be part of. He turned back to the young man, his pulse racing. How did my son get involved? The young man hesitated before answering. He started digging after he saw something he wasn't supposed to. The businessman's breath hitched. Saw what? The young man's jaw tightened. A cover-up. A deal that went wrong. Someone died. The words chilled him to the bone. His son had been in danger, and he hadn't even known. The businessman clenched his fists, his voice low. Did my business partner order the hit? The young man didn't blink. He didn't just order it. He made sure no one could ever prove it. Silence. The businessman's chest burned with rage. All these years, he had sat across from that man. Shaken his hand. Trusted him. While his own son had paid the price for his silence. A dangerous decision. The young man studied him carefully. If you go after him, he'll come after you. The businessman let out a bitter laugh. Let him try. He reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over a familiar number. His business partner. But before he could dial, the young man's voice cut through the air. You can't just call him. The businessman's grip tightened. And why not? The young man stepped forward. Because he already knows you're looking for answers. The older man's blood ran cold. Someone was watching. The storage unit suddenly felt too exposed, too open. A sickening realization crawled up his spine. If his partner knew, that meant they were already in danger. He looked at the young man. We need to move. The young man nodded. I have a safe place. But once we go, there's no turning back. The businessman exhaled sharply. No turning back. He thought of his son. The years he had spent mourning. The regret that had eaten him alive. And now, finally, he had the chance to make things right. His voice was like steel. Then let's finish what my son started. The businessman's breath was heavy as he gripped the folder. The truth was finally in his hands. His son had tried to expose corruption, and paid the price with his life. His own business partner had orchestrated everything. The fraud. The money laundering. The cover-ups. And now, he knew. Which meant he was a threat. The young man's voice was calm but firm. We need to move. Now. The businessman's pulse pounded. He took one last look at the storage unit, at the pieces of his son's past, before nodding. They had work to do. A safe house in the shadows. They drove in silence, the city lights flickering past the car windows. The young man guided him through back streets and alleyways, finally stopping outside a small, run-down apartment building. The businessman frowned. "This is your safe place?" The young man smirked. "No one looks for millionaires in places like this." He had a point. Inside, the apartment was minimal, just a table, a few chairs, and stacks of documents spread across the room. It looked like a war room. The businessman's throat tightened. His son's fight wasn't over. And now, it was his. He sat at the table, staring at the evidence before him. "What's the next move?" The young man leaned against the wall. "Your business partner is untouchable. He has people everywhere." The businessman exhaled sharply. "No one is untouchable." The young man slid a file across the table. "There's one way to take him down." The businessman opened it, and froze. A name. A reporter. Someone willing to expose the truth. The older man's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. His son had died trying to get this story out. Now, it was his turn. The trap is set. They spent the next 2 days compiling everything. Bank statements. Emails. Transaction records. Undeniable proof of corruption. The businessman made one final call. To his business partner. "We need to meet." His partner's voice was smooth, controlled. "Why so urgent?" The businessman forced himself to stay calm. "We have a problem. But I have a way to fix it." There was a pause. Then, "Tomorrow. My office. Midnight." Click. The businessman exhaled, setting the phone down. The young man folded his arms. "You just walked into the lion's den." The older man smiled grimly. "No. I set the trap." The midnight meeting. The city was quiet when the businessman arrived at his company's headquarters. He stepped into the elevator, his heartbeat steady. This was it. The doors opened. His business partner sat behind his massive desk, a glass of whiskey in hand. "You look tense," the man said smoothly. The businessman walked forward. "I know everything." His partner's lips curved into a smirk. "And?" "No denial. No excuses. Just arrogance." The businessman threw the folder onto the desk. His partner barely looked at it. "You're too late." The businessman narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" A slow, cruel smile. "I knew you were snooping around. You really think I'd let you leave this building alive?" The businessman's stomach dropped. A shadow moved behind him. Security. Armed. His body tensed. It was a setup. The tables turned, step away from the desk. A deep, unfamiliar voice echoed through the room. The businessman's partner froze. The young man stepped into the light, flanked by 2 federal agents. The businessman's pulse raced. His partner's eyes widened. "What?" The young man held up his phone. "A live recording. Broadcasting everything." The businessman smiled coldly. "You were right about one thing." He leaned forward. "You don't leave this building alive." The doors burst open. More agents stormed the room. His partner's cocky smile vanished as they forced him to his feet, slapping cuffs around his wrists. The businessman exhaled sharply, his chest lighter than it had been in years. It was over. Justice. For his company. For himself. For his son. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the glass windows of the skyscraper. The businessman stood in stunned silence, watching as federal agents led his former business partner out of the building in handcuffs. It was over. For the first time in years, his chest felt lighter, like a weight he had carried for too long had finally lifted. But the reality hit him just as fast. This wasn't just about his business partner. His own company's name was in those documents. His empire, his entire legacy, was now tied to corruption, fraud, and murder. The young man stood beside him, watching the scene unfold. Now comes the hard part. The businessman sighed, rubbing his temples. I know. The young man studied him. Are you ready to lose everything? Silence. The businessman looked out at the city skyline. This company was his life. But then he thought about his son. The boy who had fought for the truth. The son he had ignored when it mattered the most. He turned back to the young man, his voice steady. If losing everything means honoring my son, then yes. The young man nodded, approval flashing in his eyes. Then let's finish this. The fallout begins the next morning. The businessman sat in his office, staring at his phone. The calls were non-stop, shareholders, reporters, even old friends. Everyone wanted to know how deep the corruption went. And everyone wanted someone to blame. His assistant stepped in, her face pale. Sir, the media is waiting outside. They're demanding a statement. The businessman exhaled, standing up. Then let's give them one. The young man followed him as they walked toward the lobby. The moment the doors opened, the press exploded with questions. Did you know about the fraud? Are you stepping down as CEO? Was your son murdered to keep this a secret? The businessman raised his hand for silence. Then, in a calm, firm voice, he said the words that would change everything. For years, I built this company believing we stood for something good. But I was wrong. My son tried to warn me, and I didn't listen. That mistake cost him his life. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. I can't undo the past, he continued. But I can ensure that justice is served. Today, I am stepping down as CEO, and I will work with authorities to make sure everyone responsible faces consequences, including myself. Gasps. More flashes. The businessman felt the young man's gaze on him, a mix of respect and understanding. This was his final act of redemption. The last goodbye hours later, after the reporters had left, the businessman walked through the now empty hallways of his office. This was the last time he'd ever be here. His fingers brushed against the framed photos on the walls, pictures of celebrations, victories, deals won. None of it mattered anymore. Then, finally, he reached his son's old office. He stepped inside, feeling the weight of regret settle in his chest. His son had sat here once, fighting for the truth. Fighting for something bigger than himself. The businessman swallowed hard. I should have listened to you. The room was silent. But for the first time, he felt like his son had finally heard him. A new beginning outside, the young man leaned against a car, waiting. The businessman walked over, his movements slow but sure. What now? The young man asked. The older man exhaled. Now. I rebuild. Not his company. Not his fortune. But himself. The young man smiled faintly. Your son would be proud. The businessman's throat tightened. He glanced at the young man, finally allowing himself to ask the question that had haunted him since the beginning. Who are you? The young man's gaze softened. Then, he pulled something from his pocket, a dog tag, old and rusted. The businessman's breath hitched. It was his son's. A lump formed in his throat. How do you have that? The young man smiled, a small, knowing smile. Because he gave it to me. Understanding dawned like a slow sunrise. The pieces finally clicked. This wasn't just a stranger. This young man was the last person his son had ever helped. The businessman felt his vision blur. His son's final act hadn't been in vain. And now, his mission lived on. The sun was setting over the city skyline, casting golden hues over the towering buildings. The businessman stood by his car, staring at the dog tag in his hand. His son's dog tag. He turned it over between his fingers, feeling the weight of it, the weight of everything he had ignored, everything he had lost, and everything he had finally come to understand. The young man, the last person his son had helped, stood quietly beside him. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Because in that moment, the businessman finally knew. His son's life hadn't been wasted. His fight hadn't been in vain. And now, it was his turn to carry that fight forward. A legacy reclaimed. The next morning, the businessman walked into the federal building, his suit crisp, his posture firm. But for the first time, he didn't feel like the powerful CEO he once was. He felt like a father seeking redemption. Inside, the lead investigator waited for him. He placed a thick folder on the table, the last remaining evidence of the corruption, the money laundering, and the people involved. The businessman didn't hesitate. He signed over everything. His assets. His records. His full cooperation. There was no deal. No negotiation. He wasn't here to save himself. He was here to finish what his son started. The final confrontation later that afternoon, he walked into the prison visiting room, where a single man sat in chains, his expression hard and bitter. His former business partner. The man smirked. "I have to admit, I didn't think you had the guts to turn against your own empire." The businessman didn't flinch. "It wasn't my empire. It was yours." A pause. Then, his partner leaned forward, his voice a quiet threat. "You've made powerful enemies. You think this is over?" The businessman exhaled slowly, then placed his son's dog tag on the table between them. "It's over when I say it's over." The other man's smirk faded. Because in that moment, he understood. This wasn't the same businessman he had once manipulated. This was a man who had lost everything, and in doing so, had become unstoppable. The guards took his former partner away, leaving the businessman alone. He picked up the dog tag, tucking it safely back into his pocket. And for the first time in years, he walked out of the building without looking back. A new purpose. Weeks passed. The businessman no longer sat in a glass office overlooking the city. He no longer had power, wealth, or influence. But what he had was purpose. He worked with reporters, investigators, and former employees to clean up the mess his company had left behind. He spoke at events, warning others about the dangers of choosing power over people. And most of all, he helped those who had been hurt by the system he once upheld. He was no longer the man who ignored the truth. He was now the man fighting for it. One last visit. One evening, he found himself back at the cemetery. It had been years since his son had been laid to rest, but this time, it felt different. This time, he wasn't just here to grieve. He was here to honor. He placed a single white lily on the grave, just like he always did. But this time, he didn't feel like a father begging for forgiveness. He felt like a father finally making things right. The young man stood a few steps away, watching. The businessman turned to him, his voice softer than before. "What will you do now?" The young man smiled faintly. "Keep going." A long silence. Then, the businessman nodded. Because for the first time, he knew, his son's legacy would never die. It had simply passed on. And the fight for truth? It had only just begun. End of story. The life lesson in the end, the businessman lost everything he once valued: his company, his wealth, his reputation. But in losing those things, he gained something far greater. He learned that power is temporary, but doing the right thing lasts forever. He learned that regret is the cost of silence, but redemption is the reward of action. And most of all, he learned that his son never truly left him. Because as long as he carried on the fight for justice, his son's spirit would always live on.